Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie. I'm from Chevalier's, the oldest bookstore, independent bookstore specifically, in Los Angeles. We're celebrating our 81st year this year. And we are so excited to have all of you joining us virtually, especially tonight's speakers. Thomas Dyja, author of New York, New York, New York, 4 Decades of Success, Excess, and Transformation. And joining him in conversation is Peter Lunenfeld, professor. Oh, here, I'll make you two visible to everyone else so that everyone knows who I'm talking about. And Peter Lunenfeld is a professor at UCLA in the Urban and Digital Humanities programs, and the two of them will be leading us in their conversation about development and urbanization in New York over the last 40 years. So excited to have them joining us. All of you in attendance, you can put any questions you have in the chat, and after Peter and Thomas's discussion, they'll have time to answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Katie. Tom, I just wanted to say that I was incredibly pleased and delighted to read this book. I'm an ex-New Yorker, like so many people in Los Angeles. I'm not a member of a group that was here when I moved here in 1988 called Deny, Disgruntled Ex-New Yorkers. I'm actually a very happy ex-New Yorker. I love LA, but I also love my hometown. And I have to say that this was an incredibly fun book, while at the same time being a very serious one. And what I felt it was so serious about it was that it took politics as the Greeks intended it, right? A discussion of how the polis works, of how the city and its citizens and its leaders negotiate things. And I think that it's about a space of negotiation, and it takes compromise so seriously. The whole book is almost a series of dialogues about compromises. And it's so refreshing after more than 4 years of intense, I can't even call it ideology, I'll just call it a kind of politics as rage, to read about, such a complex organism being developed. And the first question that I'd have for you is, I know you wrote a book about Chicago, and I know you've been living in New York, on the Upper West Side mostly, for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
What made you decide, like, this is the book I'm going to do now?
Well, it was kind of that very, divisive is such a beat up word now that I hate to even use it, but very binary take that people had and were having, I think to some degree still have, about New York, cities in general, but very much New York, as the Bloomberg years were coming to an end. It was these kind of catchphrases of, gentrification, broken windows, neoliberalism, all these things were kind of thrown out as if we were supposed to know exactly what that meant, and that anything, you could just say that and you were supposed to kind of go in a certain way. And having lived in New York for 40 years, having seen these policies enacted, having seen where the city had been and where it got to, not through, by any stretch of the means, the kind of politics that you mentioned of two-sidedness, but very much through a sense of pragmatism, a sense of people taking responsibility for the city, trying to create effectiveness through the city, trying to make it really just simply work, that it was very frustrating to have the discussion about where we were going in terms of this very black and white way. So I really wanted to go back to the beginning and kind of get to the bottom of how the change happened, not in an ideological way at all, but really see what were the policies, who were the people who were involved, what drove them, what drove them, were they obsessed with something, what were the events, kind of, and do it in real time, or as much as I could to kind of convey the lived experience of it, because in a certain way, it's a book about frogs being boiled in a pot. We didn't all necessarily jump up and say, hey, with this, it was how life was. And I wanted to try to get to, or to think about, how these things take place over time, generationally, without us really ever popping up and saying, this isn't going right. I mean, there were times when it happened. So often these are good, interesting policies that were put in place that maybe should have stopped, that were matters of fixing a problem immediately, as opposed to in a place that's constantly changing and constantly flexible. To apply inflexibility to it is maybe not the best way forward. So, it was great fun. I mean, as we talk about politics and policy, that sounds kind of deadly, but I really did want to do it in the way Peter's talking about, which was as we lived, and what was that, the transition of the city as a kind of game board into something else.
One of the hardest things to write about when you're doing a cityscape portrait is to organize your thoughts and to organize the
Right.
thoughts for the readers. And you have this one kind of key concept, which is that New York is constantly shifting between order and disorder. And then you have these 4 different periods, all beginning with the letter R. And I thought that what that did was it set up a really nice grid, which works beautifully for New York. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it took 8 years to do, and that was part of the reason why. I mean, I'll say I did not start the book kind of with an argument to prove. I mean, I can honestly say I started with a blank slate. I really wanted to go out and see what I found, and so I didn't know a lot about some of the people who are very important in the book, like Gordon Davis, who was Ed Koch's parks commissioner, who really was somebody who was kind of used parks and public space as a way to begin the process of New Yorkers thinking again about how to use public space and use it in a kind of generative way instead of a kind of free for all, which it had been in the taxi driver days. But all to say that I was looking for what the battle lines were. Surely there was some ongoing Tolkien-like battle between right and wrong through this whole thing, and it didn't really exist. No matter where I looked for it, I wasn't able to find this very clear story of that was going to be a narrative. And so I really did plot things out on a timeline, literally an 8-foot timeline, to just sort of get the events down. It looks like this crazy Ward Shelley art piece that's just all these lines and themes of what's going on over that time. And I actually, almost more visually than anything else, began to kind of chart out and be able to see, here are moments where things are exploding, here are the kind of fulcrum points of the movement. And so who's involved in those things, So I moved more over time to looking at social network theory, and that seemed to be much more of a viable and I think real expression of what was going on, as opposed to the old model. There's a very famous, or at least a once very famous book called Governing New York City, which is like a 700-page book that just picked apart exactly how all the different parts of New York work. And it came to the basic thing that there is nobody who really runs the city. It's this kind of game of interest that is played. It is like a Game of Thrones, with the mayor kind of in charge, but mostly he's kind of divvying out the spoils, and it's everyone else fighting each other. And that fell apart to a certain degree over these years. That kind of, the stakeholders become so overlapping in certain ways that you can't really pick people apart in the same way. So the network kind of model, and just thinking about it in that way, was very helpful to me in kind of getting us to that structure that I got to, and also seeing that it wasn't one smooth arc of like A to B. There were a lot of ups and downs and movements forward and back. So it felt over that time that the city was not the same place. There were major significant changes that happened over time, so that you recognize the place. If you came back after 5 years, yeah, but there were aspects of it that were very different. I quote a writer named Fernanda Eberstadt, who kind of shows up after 10 years away in Giuliani's New York, and is kind of blown away by how kind of friendly and nice and pleasant it is in this kind of jarring way that no one ever had. I mean, so, and the city goes through these 3 very, I think, distinct periods where it is the same place, but some very fundamental things have changed, and the lived experience of it also changes very much. And I think we are really now forced by outside events coming up to something that is going to be a fourth change. I think generations also have a lot to do with that.
What do you mean by the fourth change?
Well, I think that, for many years here, there was that sense, or has been the sense of, well, the virtuous cycle that Deputy Mayor, Bloomberg's Deputy Mayor Dan Doctoroff calls, where we bring more people into the city and we build more real estate, and it throws off more tax revenue, which lets us pay for more things, which lets us bring in more people. And it's this kind of, as he called it, virtuous cycle. But at a certain moment, it becomes kind of a vicious cycle, not to get too, punny about or something, but it becomes the point, as opposed to really asking what's good for the city, And so this drive to keep building more, to bring in more people, it's okay, let's build more because we need more tax revenue, because we have to pay for more things, and no one, you'd look around and say, well, gee, this kind of has to stop. When is something going to change here? And no one ever wants to jump off the merry-go-round, And the pandemic has really brought, I think, things to a head in certain ways. I don't think we're going to be able to get away without looking at some of those issues. And I think over time, you get all of these cycles have a certain generational aspect to them. I mean, certainly the arc of the book is kind of boomers in New York, basically. And so I think we're looking at the boomers starting to move, some of that movement out is old people, that's us, Peter, older people, that boomer generation kind of moving on and starting to make room in some way for what the next generations are going to do when they take power in the city. Certainly the boomers don't start with power in the city. It's really the Clinton years when that kind of begins. So I think what happens next is, I don't know, but they don't necessarily want the same city that exists in this book.
I think it's also very important. Sometimes when you write a book like this about a city, you're asked about like what's next. When I think this book is very much about what's happening. I just did a book about LA, and that was also the same kind of question, like where's it going? And there, you don't want to become an Insta pundit because there's so much to learn. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book were the details. Like, you had mentioned Gordon Davis just now, someone I didn't know from growing up, or you don't know the name of the parks commissioner when you're a kid in New York. How would you know? But I do remember how awful the Central Park Zoo was, and you have an amazing anecdote about how right after Davis is appointed, he takes his daughter there, and she says, "Never take me here again." That's on page 21, folks. Never take me here again. And
it was horrible. Yeah. I mean, the city literally, someone literally molested a goose. This is true. And literally sexually molested a waterfowl. And the staff stood around and watched, I mean, they wanted to get another sea lion, but it wasn't allowed because the federal government said, you just can't have any more animals. You don't know what you're doing. I mean, it was the idea that the New York City park system had any interest or just wherewithal, knowledge to run a zoo was just beyond, it was terrible. It was a really bad idea. And it was a kind of stepping off place for Davis to start looking at things like public-private partnerships, which, when we talk about now, people, get all upset about them, but there's so many, it's like talking about air. I mean, it's basically how cities work. They work in concert with private interest to get things done. And so bringing in, making a deal with the New York Zoological Society, moving towards the Central Park Conservancy to get public help and private help to redo the park, all that kind of starts with Davis. And he was operating from very serious kind of basis of Frederick Law Olmsted's idea of what parks should be and what their role should be and how a city works. And it was a good, wonderful, I think, balm for a way forward for the city to start thinking about public space. And certainly Bryant Park behind New York Public Library, which is such a model now, was something that came out of that idea as well of the community around it doing what they could to, and this is basically a business community there, to rehab and turn it into a place where there should be people, So as you were saying about characters, I love people like that. I mean, finding Marcy Benstock, who was really involved as one woman who kind of led the charge against Westway, which was a proposed expressway along the west side of Manhattan, which would have, they pushed how it would be this underground highway and there'd be this big, wonderful park about it. The real point was about 110 acres of new real estate that were going to be built. That would have been this kind of wall on the west side, which would have been awful, I think. And most New Yorkers were against it. So there's a lot of people who, aside from the big names, the Ed Kochs and the David Rockefellers and the Donald Trumps and all those sort of people, that what makes the city work at least as much as anything they do are the actions of people who get obsessed with things. Larry Kramer gets obsessed with things. I mean, they're just people who grab on to responsibility and participation and run with it. And they are as responsible for the city as the kind of big name famous people.
I also think it's really important for people who haven't had a chance to read the book yet to understand that this is not a New York City that's only Manhattan.
Yeah.
And you spend a lot of time talking about the redevelopment of Charlotte Gardens in the Bronx as part of the Bronx coming up. You really explain very well how being a foodie in New York in 1980 is about being someone who knows certain kinds of high-end restaurants in certain neighborhoods in Manhattan, and that being a foodie in the 21st century in Manhattan is knowing every Ethiopian place in Queens that also has a pop-up that does the occasional one.
It was also looking at, food becomes a creative art, and just looking at it was great fun to kind of trace that restaurant scene of Lutece, a handful of very fancy restaurants, right? And then yuppies come along and we're eating Jarlsberg and drinking, Kendall Jackson Chardonnay and kind of learning about those things. But over time, this sense of excellence in restaurants comes in as immigration explodes. I mean, you have 1.5 million immigrants come to New York during this time and stay. The whole restaurant scene turns over. So the Chinese restaurants give way to Korean restaurants, and it just grows and grows, and it becomes not just a cultural way in, but it becomes an economic way in, very much so for other cultures. And the aspects with boroughs, I mean, I really wanted to as well talk about Brooklyn a lot, to really talk about the city, not just as, Manhattan and the Four Dwarves or something, but as the city as a whole, and Brooklyn's expanding role in the city's consciousness, which really expands to this point to, my kids both grew up here, they're in their 20s, and they grew up with a city that they traveled all over. And Brooklyn is being an aspirational place, which is very much a generational thing. It was even in the late 70s. Tony Manero is there in Bay Ridge looking over, hoping to get to Manhattan, and that is completely upside down. Having just been to Bay Ridge last week, looks really nice. I'm sort of thinking that way. So the understanding of the city is so much broader than I think it was in a general sense. Obviously, if you were living in the Bronx, you were in the Bronx, but in a sense of what a kind of unifying way, I think the city's really evolved and functioned so much better because of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a sort of unstated, that center and periphery really changed in these 40 years. You tell a number of stories. You weave stories into this history over the last 4 decades. Some stories are going to be more expected, like cultural life and the sort of high arts.
Right.
Some, had to be told. You can't tell the story of New York in this period without AIDS. And then there's a lot, to me, it would feel strange to do that.
You can't. I mean, that was also absolutely, and the fact that we ended up, in this pandemic only made that more resonant. But I was in the talent business. I was at ICM after I graduated in New York, after I graduated from college, and this was 1984. So the agent I worked for represented Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller and William Hoffman, who wrote a play called As Is, that Luis went to every night. I mean, it was an incredibly, every man on the floor I worked on, save for one, has since died of AIDS, and so if you were in entertainment in any way, publishing or entertainment in New York in the 80s and early 90s, it was like a horrible reaping. And there was a sense that the city would never be the same. And it isn't, I mean, things that changed really have changed permanently. But on the other hand, it did heal and kind of move on. But to a point where it almost has been, I don't want to say forgotten, but for many generations, there's just not that visceral sense of what it was like to see people waste away and disappear in a matter of months all over New York and within the creative industries. So I really, sorry to jump in there, but to me, that was one of and how gay life was treated, the impact of its absence, how that had a role in changing Times Square and how we understood public space was, I think, crucial. Times Square is a more woman-friendly place. But it's no longer, not that it's not gay friendly, but it's not a kind of public meeting ground of gay life in New York that it was at one point. And it's worth thinking about what that means.
Right. Well, I was leading with that question to another story that you tell, and that's the story of New York hip hop. And it's woven all the way through. And I have to admit that as I was reading, I kind of felt I was watching a high wire act because you are like perhaps me, not what people would think of as a natural chronicler of hip hop. And you like me, you may have picked up a taste for hip hop when we were both in college.
Right. I mean,
in the 80s,
at the same time, we were in New York. I was, lucky enough to have friends in the East Village. So, I was down there, not unoften. That's not even a word, but so it was something that I grew up with and was around and was in the middle of. And I think for me, I was because I was down there to some degree, I did get to see and had friends who were really in it. I mean, who were seriously involved. And I did get to understand, and I write about Robert Ferris Thompson, who's a brilliant Yale professor who's written a couple of the, I think, really critical books on Afro-Atlantic culture and how culture in the West Indies, Black culture in the Western Hemisphere is so deeply connected with African culture and its manifestation. So he's written about tango, and he wrote a wonderful book called Flash of the Spirit. And he was really explaining how, at the time, what was going on in hip hop really was an expression of these same kind of bundle of arts that were connected all the way back to Africa, And so what we were seeing when you had break dancers and you had Africa Bambaataa was a new expression of some very, very, very old things. But for the first time, they were really upfront and they were centered. And Madonna wasn't dancing in front of Black dancers or Latino dancers. She was dancing with them. And that was a very, very basic aspect of that downtown scene then, which I think, the jump to Brooklyn ended up being a much, melanin challenged kind of thing. That downtown scene was about foregrounding a lot of those kinds of arts.
Your analysis of this sort of Williamsburg hipster invasion is a very sophisticated one in terms of its analysis, not just of class, but also of race. And, people have pointed out the racial issues that were going on, but I think you historicize them really well within a larger discussion. In terms of race, you're also very, very direct. And I have to admit, reading this again after, a year after George Floyd's murder, there were so many names that resurfaced in my mind, like Abner Luema, that had been there. And, it felt like a kind of return of something that had not gone away.
Right.
And yet you also do this really detailed, almost econometric analysis of policing changes as they relate to, data systems. And, again, that's one of the things that I write about and do. So I loved it. But I wondered, did anybody say, hey, Tom, maybe there's a little bit too much about information theory in this book? Did you get
let me walk out. They gave me all the rope I could run with. No, the the original manuscript I had in was about 310,000 words long. So there was a whole other book that was there.
All
So
right. So
there was
somebody,
a lot of, and I do think I had to overwrite, that's how. So there are there are certainly stories, and God knows if you want to know anything about how the movie Wild Style was made, I got it. There are things that I have so much information on that I just had to cut and cut and cut. So the policing, though, and the race in policing was really crucial to me, because it was something that repeatedly all through, if you want to pick certain things that are constants in New York City over this time, it is some kind of horrifying police murder of young black men, with the exceptions for the Eleanor bumpers now and then. But, Michael starts with a guy named Arthur Miller in Brooklyn that starts off a small wave of protests. But the idea that New York is this most liberal bastion in the world still kind of holds until the late 80s, when you have Bensonhurst and Howard Beach, and Al Sharpton steps up. And, he's got a crazy past and crazy hair and crazy clothes, but he's the first person to really say, it is racist, and we are going to protest, and we're going to make noise about this. And he becomes a very visible, very divisive, very controversial, ultimately, I think, very responsible in the last decades about how he handles that power. But he really was a valuable person for stepping up, as much as he got in everybody's face in ways that now I wish I would have been more responsive to at the time. I mean, I think there were a lot of people involved with that. So, but all through this time, you see police murders, policemen through Giuliani, Dorisman, just Luima. It just happens over and over. And then it gets to 9/11, where the enemy crime is dropped. We've enforced a kind of occupying army on New York, which has nothing to do at this point with real policing, I think, because the kind of the data you're talking about has a lot to do with what really caused the crime drop to happen. And there's a whole lot of different things that flowed into that, and the policing kind of met that and came together. But the enemy becomes the guys outside, the terrorists, and that allows fear to become an underlying power behind the Bloomberg years, that being kind of selfish is okay because you're worried about your family. And we know what Richard Sennett calls intense families, which he was writing about in the 60s, becomes very clear in the Bloomberg years, where everyone's huddled close because of, Katie Tong said it's a red alert day. And that was, having lived through 9/11, it was a visceral kind of thing that, again, went on too long. And on the policing side, also allowed the NYPD to continue with stop and frisk and kind of street things that, again, went way beyond what should have been a kind of almost like a chemotherapy, something that needed to be applied to a very sick moment, was continued on and became just a corrosive thing on the city. So it was, in a way, you could count on more of that happening without question.
You brought up Sharpton, and he was one of the people that I noticed as I was reading along, in part because I feel like one of the undiscussed, well, we've discussed everything about the Trump era, and this book probably found its form in the tail end of the Trump era, right? I mean, you were editing it.
Yeah, I was kind of cutting,
right. And okay, and the Donald shows up all the way through in all of his, pathetic manifestations. And so does, Giuliani has this rise and fall and rise again, this blip with 9/11.
Right.
And, just this past weekend, the FBI broke in and grabbed all his stuff.
Broke in is not the right word there, Peter. I think they had a warrant, from what
I think they had a warrant. Yeah, exactly. Well, I wish it was. My politics are invisible at this point.
Yeah.
But what I feel this book does a really interesting job of, without barely even mentioning it, is that it brings that New York of Queens and Archie Bunker and Donald Trump and the New York that's close, that we call Long Island, right? The inner ring of Long Island, which is where we get Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, that great loofah fanatic, right? And you make a case about these sort of the moaning and raging against coastal elites by the coastal elites of
Right.
Fox.
Right.
And that there's this entire kind of New York battling way of talking and intersecting and bringing white racial grievance that we see in various flashpoints in Queens and Brooklyn in the 70s and 80s, and that all explodes nationwide in the Trump era. And we've got all these purely New York people like Lev Parnas, right?
It explodes before, though. I mean, under Dinkins, Rodney King, LA is the place where it's
Right.
blowing up. I mean, it is a sort of a flame that sadly jumps around to a certain degree, in terms of that kind of Archie Bunker world. It was how to take. Well, I'm going to pass on that. I had a thought and it jumped out of my head as it jumped. So it's 9 o'clock in New York.
I know, that's why boomers are losing control.
Exactly. No, it's so embarrassing, but there you go.
It's that simple. Are we ready to open to
sure, however.
Q&A? I mean, we've got our first. Katie, do you want to do this? Do you want to? Can we open it for voice discussions too, Katie? What do you think?
Sure. Yeah.
If Raul wants to ask that question, it's such a great one.
We have an intimate group.
Yeah.
All right, here. Raul, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question, that would be great.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm a native Angelino, married to a New Yorker, and I've had the opportunity to live and work there. So I find this very interesting, both from afar and from very close. I'm really blown away at how wonderful your book sounds. I'm really really thrilled to read it. It's much better than I could have anticipated. So thank you in advance. I'm looking forward to getting a copy. But my question is, as a result of having written the book, what conclusions have you come to? What 3 conclusions have you come to about New York and about our country?
Big question there. I found myself much more hopeful about New York as it being a very resilient place, and finding and really getting to talk to and know some of these, community organizers, people who are really in the grassroots level, and seeing just how much they got done and how responsible they were for really important change in the city gave me a lot of faith in it. And reminded me that participation and really the answer for a city like New York, and I think all cities, is to live in the city instead of living on it. And I think that's a lot of what happened over the years in New York, especially when we talk about gentrification. People moved onto neighborhoods instead of moved into them. And all the time I spent with it, watching people do it well and do it poorly, I just kept thinking, we could do this better. We really can. There is a way for people to move to places, because moving within cities is natural. They don't all stay the same. You need them to rise and fall for all kinds of reasons. So you need change. How do we make change work better? So that is, I think, really important. I think a kind of living in the city as a conscious act is something I came to as well. I think that's important. I mean, I think it's a real opportunity to see how you are going to be with people that day, if you want to get kind of spiritual about it. But if you believe that there's divine in humans, you get to walk out the door and really work that out. You're surrounded by them. So I really came to believe in cities more, but I came to believe in them in a much deeper kind of democratic, functional, active way, because the people who got things done were not necessarily political. They were people who put New York City above all else, with a kind of almost religious passion, you know, whatever, we're going to do the right thing for the city. And you saw that under Koch, and you saw that under Dinkins, and you saw that under Bloomberg, kind of once in a while under under Giuliani, but the sense of that was a kind of worship of a city that had passed, I think. But that sense of the city above party really exists still, and I do believe in the city. So that was a very hopeful thing to me, and I think that kind of does extend to a broader way to thinking about the nation in that sense of active democracy, you know, that starts with Gordon Davis trying to get people to pick up their garbage in the parks and live with each other, as opposed to trying to express or dominate space, you know, which is still the argument we're having. So many of the conflicts in this book are ones that we're having now. The whole discussion over culture wars. These are things that were a huge battle culturally and in the arts in the 90s. The 1993 Whitney Biennial was the terms, the vocabulary that comes out of that are what we use now to talk about identity and art and multicultural and things like that. So, you know, a lot of these things were happening along the way, and it's that participation that I think really, really matters. We took too much for granted, and we have to act on a very practical way.
Well, thank you so much. That was great.
Sure, thank you.
There's another question from B. Dykesler, if that's pronounced correctly.
Yes, it is pronounced correctly, and I apologize for not being able to be on video. First of all, I want to thank you for being here. I'm one of the owners of the store and just have come in from my other job being a lawyer.
Thank you for having me. There you are.
I had forgotten that it was at 6 o'clock rather than our usual 7 o'clock. I bet you there are going to be 50 people tuning in at 7 o'clock forgetting the change in time. But
then I would have forgotten everything he asked me. I got to tell you, 10 o'clock, I would have been under the table.
So let me, as a recovering New Yorker, it was true during the time that I lived in the city that it was commonplace to say it is an ungovernable city, that, you know, the Bronx is on fire, my favorite borough and the only one on the mainland, I hasten to add. And I wonder now, given your thoughtful work, when you believed New York stopped being ungovernable and what you attribute the reason for it being governable now too.
Right. You know, it's the answer is, I think it became governable under Giuliani because of an enormous amount of work that happened before him. I think he gets credit for making that happen, but so many pieces have been laid. You know, you don't get to walk into office and just change things. You know, the greatest projects take a lot of time, and that change can take a lot of time. And he came in and he did change certain cultures inside of City Hall. Dinkins was a very deeply felt, very passionate person, and you know, the liberal, you know, progressive vanguard, but he had a lot of trouble making decisions. And so was very wishy-washy, and things didn't get done in the same way. And Giuliani was able to have this 8 o'clock leadership meeting every morning and kind of push things forward in a bigger way. But he was able to fix things because a lot of the tools and the path to how to fix things was being laid down by Koch. There was a lot of time and a lot of problems that needed to be fixed. And so it was, I think what made it governable was, yes, during that period, Giuliani did it, but the people who did the work that he, I think, got the credit for was a generation of, you know, I would call them bureaucrats, of which Gordon was one, but there's a whole lot of other people who worked for Koch in all kinds of different areas. Nat Leventhal, who was everywhere, housing, you know, deputy manager of operations, who just shows up. And there are these people who were, when I was talking about people putting the city over politics, it was this group, this kind of cohort of Koch people who did that work of kind of bringing things, bringing technology in, of just making the city function. And they kind of jump over then eventually to Bloomberg, and a lot of them are part of the Bloomberg period. So a lot of Bloomberg's ideas, things that we think of as very forward-looking, are old ideas. It always struck me looking back that it was under Lindsay and under the zoning, kind of 1968 zoning, that so many of the ideas that come to pass during these 40 years are things that are in that zoning. The convention center, redoing certain parts of the city. All those goals are things that are laid out in the 60s. So, pulling a government, making a city governable is not just sort of, cracking the whip. It's a part of it, but you need to be able to have the harness around the horses before you can even do that. So I think Giuliani had the benefit of a lot of people doing a lot of hard work before he was able to kind of step in and become emperor for those 8 years.
Can I ask a follow-up and related question? And I promise I'll
you
shut
would.
up. So now I can't resist asking about how a Robert Moses or the Robert Moses would have functioned in the New York as we know it today. What about this kind of emperor planner position in light of what New York City is like today? How would that fit?
Well, so much of what, part of the way Lindsay is elected, and this is going even further than the book goes, but into the kind of prehistoric period of the book, is as a kind of youthful fight back, against Moses. There is, once again, a kind of generational change here. And Lindsay comes in not just wanting to decentralize a lot of things, but there's a lot of movement. City charter actually forces him to decentralize, and land use policy is really developed that is not going to allow that kind of Moses, one man in charge of everything kind of mindset. So you have ULURP, the Universal Land Use Process, I forget what the acronym is, but getting something done now, everyone complains at how horrible and how difficult it is and all the red tape and blah, blah, blah. Then the fact is a lot of it's there for some pretty good reasons, which is that to stop a Moses or developers from just overnight dropping something in there. So, there are benefits to red tape. Under Bloomberg, Dan Doctoroff, who is kind of his right-hand guy, is brought in and he has a kind of Moses-like sense. Bloomberg was someone who put a lot of power in people's hands and let them run with it, and Doctoroff ran with a lot of it, and was involved in kind of Hudson Yards was that big development on the west side where the was going to be a stadium, but now it's just this skyscraper museum. They're just these skyscrapers packed together. It's massive amount of square footage, but he came close to there was that sense under Bloomberg of remaking the city with kind of Bloomberg-like, not Bloomberg-like vision, Moses-like vision. And people called it, the other person who's involved in this point is Amanda Burden, who is head of city planning, who has a much more kind of Holly White, people-based in the streets kind of thing. So they talk about, ruling like, or Jane Jacobs. So it's like build like Moses, but with a Jane Jacobs eye kind of thing. The idea was that Doctoroff and Burden would balance each other off, which to some degree they did. But at a certain moment, the city does need to have, and you could argue it did need after 9/11, someone who was willing to flex. David Rockefeller called it catalytic bigness. And I think it was valuable. I think it was necessary. I think the kind of catalytic bigness the city needs now isn't necessarily in terms of development. It needs some big, crazy ideas of the sort that, when Peter mentioned Charlotte Gardens in the Bronx, when we think of the Bronx, that, where they filmed The Wolfen, they're piled the acres and acres of just rubble on top of everything in like one apartment building standing in the middle of it. This idea of a city just laid to waste. What he and a woman named Genevieve Brooks, who ran a community organization called the Desperados in the South Bronx. And what they said was, people want houses. Let's try something that is completely insane. And so they put in a series of ranch houses in the South Bronx, which are still there. They got a lot of pushback, that high density is what you need. And there's truth to that. You wouldn't build the whole area like that, but people bought these and families went in there and suddenly there were trees. And it was kind of this crazy idea that started much, much more redevelopment in the South Bronx and spurred development. And so in a way it was a small scale thing, but it was catalytic bigness. And I think that's what we need to have now, are some crazy ideas that spur people back and spur us forward.
Yeah, I think
Thanks.
we're sort of going through exactly the same issue in Los Angeles. Like there's a sense right now that new ideas have to come to the city, and that the kind of the last 40 years in the same way, like we've got to figure out growth, we've got to figure out inequity, we've got to figure out justice issues, we've got to figure out policing, and all of those are sort of like on their way. We had another question from Jay Douglas. If Jay wants to say it.
Jay?
There I am. I'm here.
There you are.
Ah,
I just wanted to thank all of you for putting this talk together. It's fascinating. And I really, I'm born and raised in New York, and I just love hearing about the city and trying to get a handle on some of the changes. And that was that's the question I wanted to bring here is when I grew up in New York, this was in the 60s, we had a very strong sense of place. Neighborhoods were an important part of it's how you identified yourself.
Right. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up in Kingsbridge Road and Jerome Avenue, if you know where that is, in that area. And now as I look back when I visit New York again and look at the changes, the internet has changed what our notion of place is.
Yep.
And I'm wondering what you saw as the effect on New York from all of this, and has that effect been for the better or worse?
Well, it's interesting because I think that was when I was talking before about collectives kind of coming apart and trying to find those groups and really looking to networks as more of the way. I mean, that is kind of a lot of the passage of how the city works in the name of democratization. Certain old kind of established collective groups are broken apart. And I think that happens along with the internet emerging over this time. It is certainly, as we talked about other themes, Brooklyn and AIDS and gay life in the city and hip hop, technology is very, very much a part of the story of here. One of the reasons why the city wasn't allowed back into the bond market in the 70s was because nobody could figure out the budget. There was literally no understanding of money paid out and money coming in. And so the bank said, before you get another dollar from us, you have to figure that out. You actually have to create a computer system that can account for the money coming in and out. So technology plays a role throughout this whole story. And at certain points, I don't even want to say fortuitous, but it is kind of remarkable that the personal computing becomes a big thing during the Dinkins years, which is a year, a period when people are not going outside. Honestly, I mean, they are, but crime is high. It's a not a pleasant time to be in New York, frankly, but it was a great time to mess around and and play backyard baseball with your kid or something. It was a great time to learn computers. And then later we see, during Giuliani years, the rise of Silicon Alley here that also kind of socially fits so well. These things so often, I don't think they're on a parallel track. They really are the same river moving forward. So its impact on the city was, I think, ultimately negative. We see it the streets with no stores in them right now, which is not just because of the pandemic. The pandemic pushed a bad situation into just utter crisis. The real estate costs and the lack of kind of street retail is terrible. And it's real cause. Yes, landlords are and high rents are a big deal and a major part of it. But online retail is inescapable. I mean, there's literally the trucks are lined up around the block and blocks in New York right now with people delivering. They're carving out kind of places, putting up signs. This is where trucks go, so you can just unload them. It's terrible, and that's a tech thing. I don't know how we deal with that on a city level, though. It's very, very hard. I have this argument with my son and complain, cars wrecked everything. We changed cities to be great for cars, as if we were going to have a meeting and say, all right, no cars. We're not going to have any cars in New York City. And I say it is like the internet. It's like technology, which is good and bad. And we have very often let the potential, the promise, really, really outstrip what it eventually delivers. And I think gave much too much away to cars. And I think we've given much too much away to technology on the promise of all the good things, and the bad things are at least outweigh them. So I think we've done a very bad job at that, but it's hard to manage those things in midair as well. Not to throw three metaphors together, but it's hard to, how do you say we're not going to build highways? I think it would have been incredibly difficult to stop Moses from building some of those highways.
Great. Thanks very much. And
Sure.
I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
All right, Thomas, I have a question if you have time. I know
Yes.
we're getting late in
I'm good.
the
I'm
East
good.
Coast. Okay. Well, in light of all of this, because I've been thinking about this all evening, are there moments in the period you've been looking at that could predict some of what comes next in light of all of those closures, in light of a lot of the damage to every city, but specifically New York, that's come with the pandemic that hastened the end of a lot of that brick and mortar retail and those experiences? Are there things that predict something positive coming out of it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, another thing that kind of always leapt out in the book was how many times people said the city is dead. It starts with everybody saying the city's dead, Ford to New York, drop dead, right? So there was this great passion for the place and people came back. Under Dinkins, when it starts, there's a horrible murder of Brian Watkins, this young kid who comes from Utah to go to the US Open, is stabbed on a subway platform. And, the budget's in terrible shape and it's the cover of Time magazine and Dave Do Something is in the Post, and the city was dead again. And 9/11 happened, and then Giuliani, everything's terrible, the budget's in terrible shape, the city's dead again. And 9/11, and no one's ever going to live in New York again, who's ever going to want to live in a big building, and everyone moves to Brooklyn, the city's dead again. And every time it comes back, every time, and it comes back bigger and stronger and more dangerous. That's why this is such a sensitive moment, is that those choices, rather than every time we sort of said, well, let's do more of this, we kind of kept doubling and tripling down on a lot of the same ideas. And we have a chance now to ask questions about some of those things. And I hope we take advantage of them. But the real takeaway is that this city has been counted out so many times. And within a couple of years, it's back and you can't get in. It's so crowded. So I have an enormous amount of hope. Having walked around the streets today on a pretty nice day, it's packed. It's packed. I mean, the Midtown, the offices aren't, but in the kind of the nightlife of people wanting to get out and get back to the things that they want to be in. Broadway, I know people there already planning, and that's in the works to get back up there. So there is such a huge amount of pent up desire to get back out there and be New York, that I really, I'm not, I'm concerned, obviously, but I'm not worried. This city is not going away. There's no other place like it. New York LA is a great place. It is LA, but New York's crazy amazing in some very fundamental ways. And we need it as a nation and we need it for the world. So I'm feeling good.
Well, that is a perfectly hopeful note on which to end this meeting. On behalf of Chevaliers, thank you to everyone who attended this evening. Thank you to Peter Lunenfeld for being with us, and to Thomas Dyja for this wonderful conversation. The book, New York, New York, New York, is available from us in person if you're in Los Angeles, or online if you aren't. And Thomas was so good as to send us a bunch of book plates, so you'll be able to get a signed copy from us. The link is there in the chat. Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good night, all. Thank you, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katie. Take care.
Thanks, Tom. Bye-bye.